I've been in meetings with the State Department the last couple of days. I serve on an advisory board. And in my discussions, it's clear that the US administration does believe there's a window that has opened, a crack. The reasons for that, I think, are depend on who you talk to, but it's clear that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, wanted to go to Beijing before the balloon incident of 2023. This week, Assistant Secretary Dan Crittenbrink, with whom I worked at the White House under Obama, is now the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and a trusted confidant of Secretary Blinken and of President Biden, was in Beijing trying to coordinate plans for either a renewed visit by Secretary Blinken and also thinking ahead to the APEC meeting in the fall, which is going to be held in San Francisco and to which President Xi very much would like to attend. And so I think there is this sense that there's a window of engagement. But I think the premise, Peter, of the question is not quite right, because I don't know anybody in the US administration that believes that if the window is open and we're able to get through it, that somehow on the other side is a whole new set of Chinese officials who are going to say, oh, we're sorry we haven't been transparent about our nuclear weapons activities. We really want to talk to you and let's avoid misunderstanding. I don't think that's the sense here. I'm of the mind, and I think I'll go as far to say is I think this is fairly widely believed in the Washington nuclear security geek community, as we are, that China is building up its nuclear forces, the same as they've been building up their conventional military forces, that we're probably not going to be able to dissuade them or convince them to stop that, and that they will, in 10 or 15 years, have many more nuclear weapons than they have now. The question is, why are they doing this? How will they behave as their nuclear weapons capabilities grow? And are we going to be able to work out some kind of rules of the road so that, just as we did with the Soviet Union and just as we have with Russia, even when things get lousy and our troops and our ships and our aircraft come into close proximity with each other, we know how to pick up the phone, who to talk to, and how to avoid things from getting out of control unintentionally, right? You have to write off the idea that the Chinese or Russians might want to send us messages and create a risk of escalation to get our attention or to coerce us. But most leaders don't want to get into a problem unless they want that problem. And so we don't have those rules of the road right now with the Chinese. We don't know what frequency to tune our radios on our Navy ships to communicate with them. And so those are some of the basic building blocks that we hope to be able to work out. But I don't think anybody, Peter, in the US government thinks we're going to get talks and they're going to say, oh, we're sorry, we'll stay at 400 nuclear weapons when you remain up at 3,500. That I don't think is the world that we're going to be dealing with for the next 10 or 15 years.
Then the question is, well, what is the world we're going to be dealing with?
Well, then you get into my wheelhouse, Peter, which is let's talk nukes. I don't know how much background the audience has, and so if I start to do too many basics, just wave me off or tell me to skip ahead a bit. But look, the United States has had nuclear weapons since 1945. Russia, Soviet Union has nuclear weapons since 1949, and China's had nuclear weapons since 1964. So we've been doing deterrence with nuclear weapon states for over 60 years, longer than that, over 70 years. So the basic underpinning that guides nuclear policy, as insane to the average American or Russian or Chinese as it might sound, is we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy you, even if you go first. And you have enough nuclear weapons to destroy us, even if we go first. So there's no incentive for either side to go first or ever. So let's avoid that world from happening. And that's essentially the premise of mutually assured destruction. That's the counterintuitive logic that has guided US and Soviet and Chinese nuclear policy for decades. The question is, the United States has about 3,500 nuclear weapons, 1,500 strategic offensively deployed under treaty, but we have a lot more in storage and that we could deploy in a year if we needed. Russia has about the same number. They have a few more. Mostly they're smaller, short-range nuclear forces, but we're seen as nuclear peer competitors, and we've accepted that. China has about 400 nuclear weapons. So they have one weapon for every 10 that the United States has, or 8 that the United States has. The concern is that in 10 or 12 years, they could have as many as 1,500 total. So maybe about half the American arsenal. And up until now, the United States has never said these words to China. We are in a mutually deterred nuclear relationship with you. We can't nuke you without destroying ourselves, and you can't nuke us without committing suicide. We've said that to Russia and the Soviet Union, but we've never said it to China. And so the question is, does China look to its nuclear forces as a way of telling the United States, we don't care if you say it or not, we know we can survive a nuclear strike and still destroy you, so we'll have a mutual deterrent? Or do we think they're building up their nuclear forces so they can say to us, yeah, we know you want to protect Taiwan, but you can't do anything about it. If you want to fight, you're going to have to come and fight over in our backyard. And the United States is looking at that world and saying, okay, well, we may have to build up our conventional forces as China increases their nuclear forces. We may have to build stronger interoperable military alliances with Japan and South Korea and Australia and the Philippines and other countries, so that China doesn't think that they can rewrite the international system by force. That world where we have to work as nuclear peers with China is somewhat new to us. We've done that with Russia for a long time. We're doing it now, right? I mean, yes, Russia has undertaken this horrible illegal invasion of Ukraine, but they've never attacked NATO territory because they know that that's a different world. The question is, with China, will they understand that it's a different world when they go toe-to-toe with the United States? And how are we defining our security requirements? Does it include Taiwan? We know that it includes Japan and South Korea, but Taiwan is a different type of animal because we have the one China policy. We don't have a formal treaty alliance system with them. So that world where they have enough nuclear weapons to hold us at risk reliably is a challenging one. And the questions, I think, are threefold. One is, how many nuclear weapons does the United States need to maintain mutual deterrence with Russia and China at the same time? There's a debate. The really smart people like me say, look, as long as you can destroy enough of their population, military force, and economic power, then you don't need to hold every single nuclear weapon at risk, right? 3, 5, 700 is probably enough. There are others who say, no, no, no. In order to deter, you need to match weapons 1 for 1. And since we're going to have to deter China and Russia together, we need to take Russia's arsenal, add to it China's arsenal, and then that's our new bottom line. If you think through the calculus of that, that's a recipe for an unending arms race, where every time we build up over Russia, they try to match us, then China needs to build up, then we need to do a new calculation. That's how we build back up to where we were during the Cold War, keeping in mind that in the 1970s, we and the Soviet Union had 70,000 nuclear weapons combined, 70,000. Today, the world has roughly 12,000 nuclear weapons total. The idea is that we should get rid of all of them, but there's a big difference between 70,000 and 12. But you can imagine a world where we get back up to 15, 20, 25,000 if the United States, Russia, and China are all racing. So to me, the only answer is as follows. The United States, Russia, and China have to acknowledge that they are going to be able to mutually deter each other, that they can hold each other and we can hold them at risk at a certain level of nuclear weapons. We need to figure out what that equilibrium is. And we have to figure out whether we, the United States, is prepared to live in a world where we are not the world's preeminent nuclear power. That's a very hard thing for the United States to think through politically. And it's a very hard thing for the United States security community to accept practically, because we have a different view of ours than, frankly, other countries in the world have of us, right? We think we're the good guys. So why should we have to be bound to the same system as the bad guys like Russia and China? That's clearly not the way the rest of the world views the United States, even if they understand that we're a little more benign at times than Russia and China. And even if they understand, our allies do, that we are the only thing that is standing between them and Russian adventurism or Chinese efforts to rewrite the road. So the only way this works is if all states acknowledge that there's no benefit to trying to race each other. However, because China has adopted this working principle of opacity, they will not engage with the United States. They will not describe for us why they have nuclear weapons, how many they have, how many they intend to build. It's extremely difficult for the United States to plan for the future. And so my concern is that since we assume the worst about Chinese capabilities and intentions, the political pressure will be for us to build up our nuclear forces, which will then drive the Chinese higher. And we will end up, as was described in the 1970s in the US and Soviet Union, we were like apes on the treadmill. We didn't know where we were going. We just kept doing the same thing over and over again. And I worry a lot that that's where the United States, China, and Russia are headed, unless we can figure out some way to convince China that it's in their interest to engage the United States. And I will tell you, frankly, I don't have the answer for how to do that. The US government doesn't have the answer for how to do that. And I don't even think the people in China who recognize that they would be better off in that kind of relationship, in that kind of discussions, that they themselves don't know how to convince the Chinese security and political forces that would be better for them as well.
I thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions, please. And I would ask questioners to identify themselves, the organization they are associated with. Thank you. So, okay.
And Peter, and I'm going to say, Peter, up top, if I can't hear the question, I'm going to wave.
You wave, yeah, and I might sort of try to, repeat it for you, okay? All right, what? Please, Alan.
Hi, I'm Alan Roebuck from Record, climate scientist.
Alan, come here.
Sorry, guys.
Steve here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
I'm Alan Roebuck from Rutgers University. I'm a climate scientist. And the way you describe deterrence makes no sense to me, because if one country attacks another with any small number of nuclear weapons, it's going to cause so much climate change that they're all going to die from starvation. So they're acting as suicide bombers. And for deterrence to work, everybody has to think that they're going to kill themselves first. Does that thinking work in at all to the logic you're talking about? That's the answer to your question, how to solve this, by the way.
So I agree with you. I've been following your work and work of other climate scientists. I'm on the board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, so I work with a number of the leading climate change experts. And I work on nuclear weapons, but climate change is really scary. So of course you're right. I would say two things. One, no, it doesn't factor in, because the community that handles security, nuclear weapons planning, military force-on-force calculations is very insular. It is a stovepipe and an ivory tower all to itself. And so while the military has gotten better about thinking through the effects of climate change for operations or climate change for basing, they're not very good in how that affects things like nuclear planning. So the new work that's been done over the last decade or so on humanitarian impacts, climate change, don't factor in. We still plan to lay down, in some cases, thousands of nuclear weapons on many, many hundreds of targets in different countries without recognizing that it is suicide. The view is that's the best way to convince these other countries not to go first. The second issue is it doesn't factor in because of this unique challenge that the United States has, which is we not only say that we're prepared to use nuclear weapons to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others, but ever since the Cold War was hot, we said we're prepared to use nuclear weapons first in response to conventional attacks, chemical attacks, biological attacks, and other mass conventional attacks. We don't have a policy that says we'll never be the first one to use nuclear weapons. And so our allies have become dependent on that pledge, even if it's not 100% credible. And so it's very difficult to get the military or the president or our allies to say, look, any use of nuclear weapons is a global suicide pact, because we're still based on this anachronistic Cold War mentality that nuclear weapons are the source of our security as opposed to the main source of our insecurity. And that's a mindset change, which I can't say it's slow to happen. It's not happening.
Thanks. Yeah.
You guys are all going to get your steps in.
Alex, that is not.
Can you? You can. The hot seat.
Next question, just like maybe two here. Hi, I'm Krista. I'm an editor at the New York Times opinion section. I had two questions. You described kind of like two camps, about, how to approach the situation. One camp being your camp, that we can, get by with our current arsenal or less, and the other camp being that we need to kind of get in a, one-for-one situation. So which camp is prevailing right now? Who has, can you just describe that a little bit? And the other question I have is like, this might be a weird geopolitical moment to ask this question, but if the US does not have any sort of ideas about how to get China past its kind of policy of opacity in this situation, does Russia? Like, is there any conversation happening on their end of things that, is making more progress or could make more progress?
Sure. But both great questions, and nice to talk with you. I've benefited both from the opinion section and from the editorial section for many years. And I'm from New York, so you're my hometown paper. There are actually three communities. One is the nuclear weapons work, and why would we want to change anything, right? So let's have what we have. Let's do our full modernization. U.S. is going to spend $50 billion a year on nuclear weapons for the next 30 years. It's something like $1.7 trillion to replace all of our arsenal, or maybe build up. There's the other community, which is, look, there is no finish line to this competition. So let's just agree that there's an equilibrium point and see if we can get there, and recognize, in fact, the United States right now has more weapons than we probably need to deter. The weapons that we have are actually for war fighting, or for reassurance. Don't worry, we have enough, and then some. So, can we compromise and find areas where we can compromise with the Russians and Chinese? Then there's the third camp, which is, look, nuclear weapons are immoral, horrific weapons. No president's ever going to use them. We got to get rid of them all, right? The first camp is winning. And the first camp is winning for three reasons. One, we're spending $50 billion a year on nuclear modernization. There are lobbyists for Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, and that's just that's easy, right? It's very hard to find a senator or congressman who doesn't want to maintain investment, right? Because otherwise they're against having a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. So that's a big problem. The second reason is most Americans don't think at all about these issues. They're intimidated by them. They're scared to death. They feel out of their depth. When in fact, these issues are not that complicated. They just require a little bit of time and focus. But the nuclear community, Strategic Command, the military, the Pentagon, they want to cloud this subject in some special language that makes it opaque, right? So we talk about force exchange calculations and counter force versus counter value, and survivable basing, when really what we're talking about is Armageddon. But it's impenetrable for the people. So public supports constraints on nuclear weapons. The public does not support spending this amount of money when you get a chance to talk to them. But on the top lines, they're like, yeah, we should have as many as our enemies. So that's the second issue. The third is the community that is focused on abolition, the community that's focused on constraint, has to argue against bumper stickers, right? In order to create change, you have to convince a whole array of people in the public, in the defense community, in the broader economic community, that there are better ways to go about that. And in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And so it's just very difficult to get people to wrap their heads around that calculation. Clearly it's the first community that's winning. And if you ask me to bet, I'd say we're getting back on the treadmill. That's the way the calculation is right now. In terms of Russia and China, so I've spent a lot of time in Russia over the last 25, 30 years. I haven't spent nearly as much time with China. So I think that's part of the problem. We have a lot of Russian Soviet experts. We don't have a lot of China experts in the United States that really understand the power structure there. And it's changed as Xi has taken hold and made it much more insular. But my sense is the Russians are now the junior partner. They really don't have much of a say in what's going on in China. Russia is increasingly dependent on China for a whole host of things, from oil sales and arms purchases and political support. And it's not clear to me that Russia has an incentive for China to cooperate with the United States, right? I mean, Vladimir Putin's vision is now, how do I get through next week, right? Or how do I die trying? So, there are Russians that we've worked with that were instrumental in us working out these norms of behavior. They're also under fire and vulnerable in Moscow. So to the extent that they would support us, they're also looking over their shoulders and not going out on balconies and making their own tea. So, there's a problem there in terms of, but the idea is sound, that can we use the lessons from the Cold War to help China get on board? The problem is when the Chinese hear us say, let's work out some of these guardrails, the same things we did during the Cold War. They say, how did that end for the Soviet Union? So they're not sure they want to repeat that. Their view is, look, we have plenty of money. You have 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons. Russia has 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons. That's clearly what global superpowers do. So what's the big deal if we have 1,500 nuclear weapons? Now, they don't even say that. They just say, they're windmill farms. And eventually we'll have to, convince them that, look, we know and you know that we know. So the hope is we can at least lie to each other. But the only prognosis is you got to start small and incrementally build up some conduits so that the Chinese don't think that we're doing this in order to get a leg up on them, that we're actually serious about engagement. And that gets to a fundamental problem, which is there's some parts of the nuclear security community that don't want to work out a mutually deterred relationship with China. They still refer to the Chinese as Red China. They still refer to them as godless communists and still think that this is like a Cold War battle between, good capitalism and bad communism. And that's not my understanding of the relationship with the US and China. It's a much more difficult, complicated, nuanced one. But the mindset inside the US nuclear security community is very much of the Cold War mentality.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can, but I'll tell you a secret. If you look to the computer, that's easier than looking at me on the screen.
There?
Much better.
Okay, cool. My name is Steve Farvas, and I work with NPR. So I know you're talking about these big numbers of nuclear weapons and these big arsenals, and I get why people are freaked out about this, but I'm actually also curious about the smaller numbers. So, you have your Pakistan right now, which is not politically stable. There's Israel, which has nuclear weapons, but doesn't admit it. There's Saudi Arabia that seems to want to edge towards nuclear reactors. And Mohammed bin Salman said, listen, if Iran builds nuclear weapons, we're going to build a weapon. They're not signing on to the 1, 2, 3. And if you believe everything that Netanyahu has been saying for years, Iran is always a week away from having a nuclear weapon. So are you concerned at all about these other countries and these smaller numbers of nuclear weapons that are clustered in increasingly, iffy regions?
Yeah. Yes, I am concerned about the countries. I'm a nuclear tourist. I'm one of the few people that have been to nuclear facilities in Russia, in North Korea, in Iran, as well as in the United States, because I've done work in all of those countries. look, we get numb to these numbers, right? You look at one nuclear weapon in Hiroshima, one nuclear weapon in Nagasaki, destroyed those cities for decades, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and those are the small nuclear weapons, right? We have weapons that are hundreds of times the size of those. So when you start talking about tens or hundreds, you're still talking about nation-ending arsenals. And as the first question posed, that itself, we're under, the schools are closing down here because of the forest smoke coming from Canada. And that's just a little bit of, benign smoke from trees. It's not radiation and fallout. So yeah, we worry a lot about those countries. And I'd say we worry about them for a bunch of reasons. One is the United States has friends and allies close to all those countries. So whether it's South Korea and Japan near North Korea, which might have, a few dozen deployed nuclear weapons or more, Pakistan, obviously having capabilities to reach US friends and partners in the region, as you said, not very stable is an understatement. Although remarkably, the Army, which controls the nuclear weapons, the civilians that don't, have been remarkably stable in that part of the world. But how long does that last? I wouldn't guess. And we worry a lot about Iran and what happens after Iran, not just Saudi Arabia, but Turkey. I've done a bunch of research there where they say we've had a stable border with Iran for 500 years because we match them. And anything they do, we do. So it's not just Saudi Arabia, but it's Turkey, it's Egypt, it's Jordan. So I'm not a big fan of domino theories, but there are real consequences when countries go nuclear. In every case, it's led to other countries following suit. And here's sort of the bottom line, and this is where I begin to sound a little bit naive to some, but it still strikes me as true. The United States has no hope of preventing the widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons to dozens and dozens of countries unless we are seen as being serious about controlling the nuclear arms competition among the larger states and working constructively towards elimination of all nuclear weapons. And my all-time favorite quote on this is from Mohammed al-Baradei, who was the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency before the dashing Rafael Grossi was in charge. And he had a quote that said, look, you can't preach abstinence from a bar stool, right? The United States is not going to forget convincing Iran not to go nuclear. You're not going to get countries to impose sanctions on Iran unless you're seen as being serious about going towards a world without them. And the more countries that have them and the more we acquiesce to that, the harder it is to see a world where nuclear weapons are not increasingly relevant to lots and lots of, for lack of a better term, middle powers. Our alliances do a lot to prevent the spread of those weapons, and that's helpful. So in Europe, we thought that Germany, Sweden, Italy, all of whom had consideration of nuclear weapons programs, never built them because of the NATO alliance. Same in South Korea and Japan. They both considered their nuclear options before joining the NPT and becoming treaty allies with the United States. But if US credibility wanes and nuclear weapons become increasingly important, then I worry a lot about not just the Irans and Saudis, and but the South Koreas and the Japans and the Australias and the Polands, because I think that's well within their capability of doing if they feel they have no other options for their security.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, please.
So what about what about the role of diplomacy in a situation like this? Because it's not just, for a country like Iran. Iran is well aware that the US has not just nukes, but a ton of other things that could destroy it in a minute. It also realizes that if Iraq had a nuclear weapon, it would have never been invaded. So, and that is a failure of diplomacy. Is that working in tandem along with this idea that we will diminish our nuclear arsenal bit by bit?
Please get my contact information from Peter, because I'd love to follow up on the question of whether it was a failure of diplomacy. Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, and we did not need to invade them, right? Because they had given up their chemical, biological, and nuclear program. So I don't think that it was a failure of diplomacy. I think it was a failure of judgment by the Bush administration and by the United States. But the underpinning element of your question, Gaddafi gave up his programs of weapons of mass destruction. He's dead. Saddam Hussein didn't hold on to his weapons of mass destruction programs. He's dead, right? Kim Jong-un learned that lesson. I'm not giving this stuff up because I could be next. And so, yes, how does the United States feel about its commitments to nonproliferation and arms control when we can ignore them every so years in order to pursue national security objectives? And I'll give you the flip side. It was the United States working with Russia and the United Kingdom that made sure that Ukraine did not retain the nuclear capabilities that were deployed on their territory after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we all signed an agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, which said we would respect international borders of Ukraine and that we would not allow threats to their territorial integrity. That's, for me, one of the strongest reasons for the United States to do what we're doing and supporting Ukraine with equipment and intelligence and training, because we committed to that in 1994. But if Russia wins and Ukraine loses territory, what does that say to the next potential victim for Russia? So you're exactly right on that sentiment. And that gets to the question of whether nuclear weapons are seen as relevant for either domestic security, stability, or international affairs. And the US is fairly myopic about this. Last line, Peter, because I know I've gone on too strong. In the extreme, I would argue that the United States is the one country that should be working the hardest to get rid of nuclear weapons, because we're the world's conventional superpower, right? So we don't need nuclear weapons as much as China or Russia. And we should make it really hard for those countries to argue, oh, well, the United States is giving up nuclear weapons, but we're going to cling to them because we're going to commit global, Armageddon. I'd rather be in that situation where we're pushing them, but right now you can't even get there because the US is clinging to its nuclear weapons theology pretty tightly.
We've got two more questions, and then we're going to let you go and let participants here go. But
great. But Peter, I will say, please share my contact information with the entire group.
I will.
Because I'm desperately sorry not to be there.
No.
Since we're running out of time, I would suggest we ask 2 questions and then
Okay. So this is Max Hine from the World Tribune and the Living Buddhism. So we recently did an interview with Asley Toye, the general chair of the Nobel Committee, and he mentioned, and you did too, that no first use was kind of both like the bare minimum that we could shoot for, but also like one of the most promising things that we could push for in civil society. So I'm wondering, what you think of that? If this seems like a promising initiative that has momentum in certain spaces that you're aware of.
Can you hold that thought, because you're going to have another question?
There were 2 questions. Is that okay? There was still one.
Okay, 3 questions. Go.
Ask one and then
go.
Hey, John, nice to see you.
No, Matt, you should have to ask me when you get back. No, that's no good.
One really quick one. Something that I've been hearing a lot, and I'm sure you've been hearing it too in the kind of DC smoke-filled rooms, is this idea that we don't, specifically it's coming a lot from the Pentagon, is that it does not matter why China is building up its nuclear forces. All that matters is that they're doing it. Every time I hear this line, I go insane, because to my mind, it obviously matters, and it's very important, and you mentioned that. I wanted to pick your brain about why you think we are hearing that from the Pentagon, why you think there's this kind of willful ignorance that's going on, because it's a line that they've really latched onto over the past 6 months to a year, and it drives me crazy. Thanks.
Look at that. A triple header.
Thank you, John. So one of the words that I clung onto in this talk was opaqueness and opacity. You mentioned that China is quite opaque in terms of their nuclear program, but you also mentioned that the U.S. Nuclear establishment has an opacity problem as well. So I wonder if you could talk about where the openings might be in the U.S. establishment to work towards a little more transparency on our side, whether you think that might be a helpful strategy as far as getting China to open up.
Great. Really good questions, and it makes me even more jealous we're not going to talk about them over drinks tonight. On the question of no first use, so I worked pretty heavily on this issue when I worked for President Obama and Vice President Biden. Again, my personal view is the United States doesn't need to threaten the use of nuclear weapons first for military purposes, that our conventional capability is both capable of deterring and defeating enemy forces. And that was before Russia proved to be the second best army in Ukraine. our allies object to that. We have been telling our allies for many decades, don't worry. Yes, we have conventional weapons, but if worse comes to worse, we will use our nuclear weapons to protect you. And so when they hear the United States think about no first use, they worry that that's part of a deliberate US effort to pull back from our commitments to our allies. And so when we considered no first use in the Obama administration, it was our allies, including Japan, right, who advocate for abolition and disarmament, who came in the most strongly objecting to the idea of no first use, because they do worry about both China and North Korea and our European allies as well. So I agree that it's a promising area of research, but there's very little support in the United States for it, and particularly not in this administration, which considered it, decided that it was going to state that the fundamental purpose for US nuclear weapons was nuclear deterrence. But because our allies objected, we're not prepared to go as far as no first use. And you can understand why. After Trump, our allies were nervous, and Biden has made mission number 1, 2, and 3, reassuring our allies, is a key part of our national security strategy. So, Matt, I have lots of reasons why I think the Pentagon is taking that line, but I think usually the right answer is the most obvious, which is it exempts them from having to explain alternatives to a buildup, right? If it doesn't matter, then we can't influence them. And if it doesn't matter, we have to assume the worst. And if it doesn't matter, then we need to prepare with all manner of nuclear capabilities, including sea-launched cruise missiles and upload capacity and hyperglide missiles. I mean, the most insane thing I've heard over okay, that's not true, because I've heard a lot of insane things. But one of the more frustrating things is under Obama, we talked about whether or not the United States needed hyperglide missiles. And the answer was no, not really. We have nuclear weapons, we can penetrate, we have lots of conventional. And then the Chinese started to do hyperglide really well. And all of a sudden, we couldn't be behind China on hyperglide. We cannot allow a hyperglide gap. We don't need hyperglide missiles, but we're going to build them and test them and spend money on them because we can't let China have them and we not have them. So the third question, and thanks for asking this, because I probably should be more careful with my language. The Pentagon and the nuclear community clearly likes to use special language to create these barriers to dialogue, but it's a different type of problem than what we have with the Chinese. So the United States is the most transparent nuclear country in the world. We annually declare how much money we're going to spend on nuclear weapons, and we disclose annually how many nuclear weapons we have. And if we're wrong, Matt Korda and Hans Christensen will say, no, you're off by 6. Because here's the documentation, right? So, we're an open democratic society that is publicly accountable. And so we are very transparent about the macro. But where the battle is going to be fought, quite frankly, is Russia has suspended its participation in the New START Strategic Arms Control Treaty, which means they are no longer exchanging data with us on where their nuclear weapons are and when they move. As a response, the United States has said, well, we're not going to share that data with you since you're not sharing that data with us. Some of that data is the same that it has been for the last 60 years. For example, some of that data is where our missile silos are. Missile silos are holes in the ground that don't move and are easily observable by satellites. But we're not going to release that information because we wouldn't want the Russians to have an unfair advantage. So, I think we will be battling on the margins of transparency. Where I do think the United States needs to do better, and this gets to Matt's question, is what exactly are nuclear weapons for? Why do we need so many? And actually have debates in Congress and in civil society and in public about whether that expense and the consequences of those investments are actually worth the benefit. Because I think if we could have that kind of debate, we could actually come to some sort of moderate position that wouldn't be as dangerous as the position we're pushing. And that position is, quite frankly, we're going to build up our conventional forces, we're going to build up our nuclear forces, we're going to build up our missile defenses, both regional and national, and we are not going to compromise in any area of our security. And what we're going to see are countries like China and other powers build up to try to either asymmetrically match us or symmetrically match us. And that, again, is a recipe for trillion-dollar defense budgets as far as the eye can see, which I don't view as sustainable in this country.